basically view the video, alright? So today, right, we will first need to outline the three fundamental modernist assumptions that we have basically assumed, alright, for this chapter, right, in our understanding of sociology. Now, the first modernist assumption of sociology would be that the social order and stability in the wider society. In fact, the classical sociologists like Durkheim were very much concerned about how society is able to achieve and maintain social order and stability. And there's also the understanding that we have seen a social change from pre-modernity to modernity. At the start of this chapter, we make a comparison between pre-modern versus modern society, right? And the three classical sociologists, namely Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, were trying to understand and account for the social change that took place in the 19th century. Now, the second modernist assumption would be that this social order can be illuminated by rationality, a rational understanding, which is based on scientific knowledge and explanation, which provides a sound and objective knowledge of societies that is way more superior as compared to superstition, irrational beliefs, customs, traditions, personal opinion, and prejudice. So we see a shift from religion, from superstitions to science and rationality based on logic and reason. Now, the third assumption would be that sociological knowledge, once validated and acted upon by policymakers, right, can lead to improvements in society, meaning that it can result in progress and development to improve, right, the welfare of the citizens in society, right? And government authorities will be able to use the sociological knowledge to implement social policies to address different types of social issues and problems like social inequalities, which include class inequalities, gender inequalities, racial inequalities, and also to reduce prejudices, like racial prejudices or religious ones. So these are the three fundamental modernist assumptions of sociology. Now, today our focus and emphasis will be on postmodern theory, and we need to consider why it is a challenge to existing theory and research that we have covered thus far, right, from the first chapter to this chapter. Now, postmodern theory is a new way of sociological thinking that would raise important questions about, first, right, aspect would be the nature of contemporary societies. The second question that we need to address would be the status of sociological knowledge, whether, right, it would still be able to preserve its privileged status in terms of our understanding of contemporary societies. And the third question would be the purpose of sociological research in terms of its usefulness, right, based on the criteria that we have used thus far. And the criteria that we have used thus far would include objectivity, standardization, transparency, replication, reliability, and the three types of validity. That would be construct, internal, and ecological validity. And these are the key criteria that we use to evaluate the usefulness, right, of sociological research. Now, for a start, we need to outline some important terms, right? Now, what is postmodernity? Now, postmodernity would refer to a kind of society or social formation that arises after modernity. Now, the classical sociologists were able to account for the social change or transition from pre-modernity to modernity, and now a new group of sociologists known as the postmodernists were trying to make sense of this new radical transformation in contemporary societies, and one that is referred to as postmodernity, right, that arises after modernity. Now, what is postmodernism? Now, postmodernism will refer to cultural and social beliefs as well as ways of behaving and lifestyles that arises from living in postmodernity, a new kind of society. And postmodernism can refer to divergent areas like music, fashion, which I'll show you in the video later, architecture, education, right, and so on, right? It's basically about the manner in which our social life is organized and structured. And postmodern theory is basically a new kind of sociological thinking that is very useful to understand this new society that we are looking at. And this new society is referred to as postmodern society or postmodern world. It is highly uncertain, it is fragmented, it is diversified and chaotic. And we will be looking at why it is so. So today's lecture, I believe, is quite interesting because it's basically about a new way of sociological thinking to understand this new kind of society, which is postmodern society or postmodern world. Now, we need to address two key or main arguments of postmodern theory. Now, according to the postmodernists, we are now living through another period of rapid social change or transformation in which modern societies are being transformed into something very different, something radically different, and that would be referred to as postmodern societies. Now, many of the sociologists' most influential theories, such as Marx conflict theory or Marxism, Durkheim's functionalist theory, Parsons' structural functionalism, right, and Weber's social action theory, and sociological concepts like class, power, gender, race, ethnicity, religion are now out of date. They are seen as irrelevant and redundant. And a new way of sociological thinking will be needed to understand this new kind of society known as the postmodern world. So the question now is, are we living in a postmodern world? And if we are, this would be a direct challenge to our understanding of sociological ontology, which we have covered in chapter 3. Now, according to the postmodern sociologists or the postmodernists, postmodern world started right from the 50s to the 60s, right, the post-World War II period. And Anthony Giddens, a prominent British sociologist, would, however, refer to the contemporary world as late modernity rather than post-modernity. Now, next we need to basically consider what are some of the features, what are some of the characteristics of postmodern world. Firstly, right, we are living in a world, right, that is experiencing globalization, and we will be looking at what is globalization, right, in the next lecture, right, where we start off with section B. Basically, right, globalization, right, there are many different understandings, different definitions and interpretations, right, and we will address that in our next lecture. Now, the next characteristic, right, is that we are living in a media-saturated society, where increasingly the media shapes our social reality. The representations of the media would become our social reality, become basically, right, what we understand about the social world. And also we see the rise of information and communications technologies in every aspect of our life. For example, in education, at work, and increasingly, right, in communication, where we use information and communications technologies to interact with one another. And the third characteristic is that there's massive increase in diversity and choice, especially in terms of family and social arrangements. For example, in the past, right, when women were born, right, the destiny, right, for a female, right, would be fairly predictable, because when a female, right, is born, right, she's expected to get married at a certain age, to be a wife and subsequently to be a mother, to produce offspring and children. But however, in a postmodern world, there are more options, there are more choice available for women. Women may not get married. They may pursue higher education, they may stay single, they may cohabitate with their partner, or they may even, right, basically choose to live with someone of the same gender. So there are basically greater diversity and choice in terms of family and social arrangements, and we will look at that in the video as well, alright? Now, so in assuming that we have now entered a new kind of society, known as the postmodern world, then there will be implications for the ontological basis of sociology or social order, which we have assumed so far. And for the postmodernist societies or social structures such as the family, education, economy, religion, mass media, and the government have been seen as diversified and fragmented, meaning that the traditional boundaries of society, such as the family, economy, education, and religion, were losing their constraining influence on individual behavior in terms of how individuals think and act. They are no longer basically able to shape the way individuals act in society in terms of shaping individual behavior. So this would imply that the traditional structures and boundaries of society are breaking down. They no longer have the constraining influence on human behavior. So the study of social institutions such as the family, the economy, religion, education would be seen as outdated. Now, our sense of identity, both personal and social identity, now comes less from social institutions like the family, religion, race, ethnicity, right, class and gender, but much more from the images and choices that are presented to us via the media, both the traditional media as well as the social media. So increasingly, in the postmodern world, we draw bits and pieces of who we are, right, from the media, from a multitude of sources from all over the place, instead of from the traditional structures of society, such as the family, class, or gender. And as such, our identity is now uncertain, it is ambiguous, it is precarious, right? And this brings about the emergence of the hybrid identities, where basically there are bits and pieces of our identities from all over the place, right? It's like a blended identity. And the loss of a stable or permanent identity is referred to as a decentering of the subject. So let's take a look at how Hall would address this. Now, according to Hall, the postmodern subject is one who does not have a fixed or permanent identity, meaning that the postmodern individual no longer has a stable identity. Alright? In terms of both social and personal identity, identity becomes a movable feast, meaning that it is now highly fluid. Alright? It is formed and transformed constantly and continuously in relation to the ways in which we are represented or addressed in the cultural systems, right, in our culture which surround us. And what happens would be that we are confronted, right, by a bewildering, fleeting multiplicity of possible identities, any one of which we could identify with at least temporarily. This means that now it is possible for us to take on multiple plural identities, pluralistic identities, and different aspects of our identities could coexist with one another, and some could be consistent with one another, while others could be in conflict or tension with one another, and we no longer hold on to any aspect of our identity for the long term. Some aspects of our identity will only be relevant only for a fleeting moment of time, for a short or brief period of time. Now, the postmodernists further claim that as the social order that once characterized modern societies has fragmented, right, and that, remember, the issue of social order, right, was a concern of Durkheim and Parsons, right, the generalizations that sociologists normally make about the relationships in society, in particular, the relationship between the individual and the wider society in terms of social structures or institutions such as family, education, religion, the economy, and the comparisons that we have made between the various social groups in terms of age, social class, race, ethnicity, gender, religion, and even professional status have become increasingly difficult to sustain, meaning that now it is hard for us to make general, regular predictions in terms of the relationships in society. In particular, right, the nature of the relationship between the individual and society. Now, in the very first lecture, we have mentioned that in sociology, we are concerned about the nature of relationships in society. And we are emphasizing on the need to basically examine the relationship between the individual and society, which is a two-way street. But in the postmodern world, it is hard for us to make generalizations about such relationships, because such relationships are no longer predictable, they are no longer consistent, they are no longer stable. Because if we consider sociological ontology that we have covered in chapter 3, where there are two main sociological approaches in terms of understanding such relationships, and we have already looked at that in the videos and in our summary. The first approach is the structural macro approach, where we basically conceptualize society in terms of structures. such as the economy in Marx's understanding, in terms of religion, right, for the kind, and so on. And on the other hand, right, we have the micro approach that emphasizes more on action and agency of the individual, how individuals actively shape society. So that is what we have covered under sociological ontology. But in the postmodern world, the postmodernists argue that such generalizations in terms of the nature of relationships in society, right, especially between the individual and society, would no longer hold. So that would basically discredit our understanding of sociological ontology. And as such, the modernist sociological concepts like social class, gender, family, religion, and power no longer work. And they are past their sell-by date, meaning that they are now irrelevant, they are redundant, they are no longer useful in our understanding of this new kind of society, which is known as the postmodern world. Thus, right, in the postmodernist view, right, these concepts have to be deconstructed. We can no longer depend and rely on them to understand this new kind of society. Right, so they are no longer useful or relevant, meaning that whatever we have learned so far, right, would be useless in our understanding of this kind of society, which is known as the postmodern world or the postmodern society. Now, next we will basically address, right, the assumption of sociological knowledge and progress. All right. Remember, we mentioned that, right, sociological knowledge, once validated and acted upon by policymakers, can result in progress and improvement, right, in the overall society for mankind. Now, we need to note that in modern societies, our faith and confidence in science, scientific knowledge, and scientific enterprises did not happen naturally. It did not happen overnight. Now, like any other major belief system, it had to be supported by what Lyotard would refer to as meta-narratives or grand narratives. Now, what are meta-narratives? Now, meta-narratives, right, are grand narratives that would be a set of ideas and assumptions that are woven into a story that provides a justification for the beliefs that we hold to be true, right, in terms of our understanding and knowledge of society. Now, thus, the meta-narratives or the grand narratives of the Enlightenment was that the Enlightenment philosophers were basically freeing or liberating people from the Dark Ages, right, where people relied on irrational beliefs, customs, traditions, superstitions to understand the social world in terms of both natural and social phenomena. But religion, superstition, irrational beliefs were replaced by scientific knowledge, scientific explanation, right, and that would lay the foundations for a more rational and improved world based on rationality, all right? So not to worry, right, later we will have a very interesting video, right, that will do a summary of what we have covered thus far, and the video will highlight some of the key issues and points in today's lecture, right? And there are quite a number of examples and case studies, right, which I will highlight to you, right, which provide useful illustrations. So you will, after this, right, you have a very good understanding of what we have covered today. Now, for Lyotard, right, the postmodern condition can be identified, right, as a skepticism, or it can be seen as a skepticism towards grand or meta-narratives. Now, not only have most people in contemporary societies lost their faith in religious and political meta-narratives, they have now also become more skeptical, meaning that they have now become more uncertain, right, and doubtful of scientific meta-narratives. Now, in the contemporary world, scientific truths are increasingly called into question. And although, right, we understand, right, and we are aware that science is certainly changing or transforming the world, however, we are no longer certain, we are no longer sure that science would necessarily change society for the better. So we can no longer be sure that scientific knowledge, right, can result in progress and improvements in society, right, that it will bring about benefits for mankind. So in the postmodern world, no form of knowledge, not even expert knowledge or specialist knowledge, has privileged status. An example of expert knowledge would be scientific knowledge, right, as well as sociological knowledge. No, knowledge is now just a commodity. The usefulness, the value of knowledge is now, right, basically dependent on the individual, whether the individual desires the knowledge or the individual could reject the knowledge. Let me give you an example. If you take a look at sociological knowledge. Now, as knowledge is now a commodity, the usefulness of sociological knowledge depends on you as an individual. For instance, as a student, if you find that sociological knowledge is useful and applicable in your day-to-day life in terms of helping you to understand who you are as a person, right? That could be your self-identity, your personal and social identity, and how you're linked, how you're connected to the wider society, the social structures of society, such as family, education, religion, right? And then you will accept sociological knowledge as valuable, right? And that, right, you will basically desire sociological knowledge, for example, by attending your lectures regularly, doing your readings, completing all your written work, right, and preparing well for the examination. Now, however, as an individual, if you find that sociological knowledge is useless, it's not helpful at all, it does not have much practical value to you, right, as an individual. It doesn't help you, perhaps, right, in your day-to-day life, and you can reject knowledge. How do you reject knowledge? Right, you can basically, right, skip lectures, right, not do your written work like your class tests, your class assignments, right, not read your lecture notes. In fact, you can actually discard your lecture notes into the bin, right, or whatever resources that you have, right, and just basically, right, reject sociological knowledge. So knowledge is just a commodity. The value, the usefulness of knowledge, right, depends on you as an individual, right? So knowledge no longer, right, when we talk about expert knowledge, it no longer enjoys privileged status, right? So it all depends on the individual. So it's highly subjective, right? So remember, the usefulness, the value of knowledge depends on you as an individual, whether you desire the knowledge or you reject the knowledge. And no one will be able to tell you, right, whether you should or you should not accept knowledge, right? You as an individual would have to decide for yourself in this case. Now, postmodernists have developed Lyotard's ideas into a critique of sociologists' meta-narratives of producing expert knowledge or specialist knowledge of societies in order to improve them, right? Basically, if you take a look at Auguste Comte, right, a founding father of sociology, he was so ambitious, right, that he believed that, right, sociology would be able to uncover general or social laws, right, to explain the whole of society, right, and with this scientific knowledge, it can help to basically bring about progress and improvements in the conditions of mankind. However, in the postmodern world, which is highly uncertain, diversified, and fragmented, it will no longer be possible to develop general explanations about societies. And the postmodernists are highly critical, right, of structural or macro theories such as Marxism, functionalism, structural functionalism, and some feminist perspectives. Now, they claim that these are simply further meta-narratives, and the only purpose of the so-called research is to try to persuade and convince people of the truth of the basic story. But in the postmodern world, there's no one universal or standard truth. There are multiple truths from various sources, especially from the media, both traditional and social media, right? So basically, right, the notion of truth is highly subjective. It's no longer objective, right? There are no longer one standard universal truth that is all-encompassing, right? There are multiple truths, right, from various sources, from different sources. And if you take a look at some evidence, right, the Marxists, right, could only find evidence of class inequality. But there are other kinds of social inequality, such as gender inequality, racial inequality, and ethnic inequality, right, which were overlooked by the Marxists. On the other hand, right, some feminist scholars would only find evidence of patriarchal domination, and that is gender inequality, right, where they find evidence of man domination over women in various aspects of society, from family to education and work, but they have overlooked other kinds of domination, especially, right, in terms of racial domination, right, the domination of the blacks by the whites. Now, the postmodernists claim that sociological concepts like class, right, power, gender, patriarchy, capitalism, right, are far too general to do justice to understand the postmodern world, which is highly complex and diversified. Now, they argue that sociological theories such as Marxism, functionalism, structural functionalism, can only be about providing specific interpretations, meaning very partial interpretations, right, on certain aspects about the social world, about society. They are not able to provide a full and complete understanding of society. Now, they argue that in the postmodern world, which is highly fragmented and skeptical, there are no longer any definite criteria for determining whether any theory, right, or research is better than another. So this will result in relativism, where any theory or research is just as good as the other. So there's no way that we can make comparison whether one research or one theory is more useful than the other. And as such, sociological research can no longer be evaluated in terms of the key criteria that we have looked at in Chapter 2, such as standardization, transparency, replication, reliability, objectivity, and authenticity or ecological validity. And like any other commodity, sociological knowledge can only be evaluated in terms of how useful people find it. And once again, right, this brings us to our earlier point that knowledge is just a commodity, right? So it depends on you as an individual whether you find knowledge useful or useless, right? So that explains basically how you treat knowledge. Like some of you here, like you find that sociological knowledge is really very relevant. It's highly useful in your understanding of who you are as a person, right? That is why, right, you're so enthusiastic about sociological knowledge. You do your readings, you attend lectures, you pay attention to the videos, you complete your assignments. But on the other hand, right, some students may reject sociological knowledge. So as your lecturer, I'm not able to tell you, right, that you should be serious in learning. You should take sociology seriously because it is you who would be able to make your own individual decision. No one is able to tell you what to do, right? So you as a person will decide whether you want to accept the importance of sociological knowledge or you can reject that. Now, postmodernists challenge sociology's claim to be about improving societies in the name of social progress. So that is basically, right, the point that we need to take note of. Now, they argue that as sociologists cannot obtain a full and complete knowledge and understanding of societies, it would simply be arrogance on their part to presume to tell people how societies ought to be improved. Now, this is very true because since sociologists, right, especially the contemporary sociologists, will not be able to have complete and full understanding of societies, then how then would they be able, right, to tell people how societies, right, could be improved, right, how societies, right, can basically change to bring about benefits for mankind. So what happens is that the most that sociologists can do will be to offer ideas about society, which people can either accept or reject. So these are some questions for your reflection, and we will address them again in the video, right? So take note of that. Now next we will basically, right, outline sociology of postmodernity, right, by examining the contribution of postmodern theory. Now, postmodern theory provided a new way of looking at culture and identity in contemporary societies, especially identities that we have discussed earlier, which is now ambiguous, it's fluid, it's fragile, it's precarious, it's no longer fixed, it's no longer stable, it's no longer consistent. So postmodern theory has provided a new way of looking at the mass media and the effects of living in a mass-mediated society. Now, according to French postmodernist Jean Baudrillard, we are now living in a hyper-reality where the images that we consume from the media are becoming more real than the things, the people, right, and the objects that they are supposed to represent. So let me give you some illustrations of this understanding of hyper-reality by Jean Baudrillard is a French postmodernist, right? Now he basically claims that now we are experiencing and living in a hyper-reality. Now let me give you a couple of illustrations to help you to understand what is meant by hyper-reality. Now our understanding of natural disasters or catastrophes like tsunami and a more recent typhoon, right, in the Philippines, would be based on the images that we consume from the media. It can be from the printed media, right, newspapers or TV, and the social media. To the extent that these images that we consume, both texture images, right, and visual images, become more real than the actual event, which is the tsunami or the recent typhoon, right, in the Philippines, right? Because in Singapore, right, we are free from natural catastrophes and disasters, except maybe flooding, right? But that's not really much of a case compared to a typhoon or tsunami, right, which is more severe, right? And how many of you here actually experience, or how many of you here actually have first-hand encounter with a natural disaster or catastrophe, and you have survived? Like you have survived the tsunami, or typhoon, or hurricane, right? The Hurricane Sandy, right? But I don't think so. But we know a lot about these natural disasters and catastrophes because of what we have read, right, on the papers or online, right, or what we've seen on the TV. So these images that we consume, right, would become more real, right, than the actual event. So that would be an example of hyperreality. Now, another example which most of you can relate to would also be the acquaintances that you have, especially on social media platforms like Facebook. Now, many of us have, many contacts or friends, so-called friends on our Facebook, right? Now, many of these contacts, right, are people whom we have not met for many years. Some could be even more than a decade, right? But you seem to know a lot about them, right? How they look, because they post their latest photos, right? And you know a lot about their day-to-day life, like where they like to patronize, right? The restaurants or eateries that they like to patronize, right? And who they are with, right? And how they feel because of their status updates on Facebook, or you follow them on Twitter, right? And you know exactly where their lifestyle, whether they're single or whether they're attached, who they're attached to. Maybe one week they're attached to A, next week they're attached to B. Sometimes they break up very quickly, a few days, right? And you know the type of food that they like, because a lot of us like to post photos of food, right? Even when it's just normal food, right? On our Facebook. So we know, right, what's happening to our friends or acquaintances on social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and so on, right? Based on the images that we consume on such social media, to the extent that they become more real than the actual person. Because some of these contacts that we have, right, on our Facebook, we have not met them for years, but you still know how they look like. For example, maybe your primary school friends, your secondary school friends, right? You know how they look like, right? Because of the images from the social media, they become more real than what they're supposed to represent, right? And very often, right, the photos that they post, right, may not really look like who they are in person. Because some of them, they like to feature, right, only certain angles, like maybe they look better, right, certain angles. So most of their photos will be certain angle. And those who are heavier, usually they only show the head, right? They don't really show the full body and all that, or certain angles. So, these images, they become more real than the actual person, right? You don't really have any face-to-face encounter with them. So these are actually examples of hyperreality, right? According to Baudrillard, we can relate to that in our day-to-day life, actually, right? And also, like for example, now if you come across like some photos of your friends and all that, right? These photos, right, of your friends, right, become more real than the actual person because your understanding of how they look like or who they are is based on these photos, right? Rather than the actual person, all right? So take note of that. So basically, right, this would raise important critical questions about some of sociology's most established concepts like social class, organization. We'll look at that in section C, gender, race, ethnicity, and power. Remember, we have actually looked at the concept of power by comparing the Marxist view of power versus Parsons' view of power. Right? Now, anyone can remember what is Marxist view of power? Is constant zero-sum view of power, right? One which is fixed, right? Stable, it cannot be expanded, it cannot be distributed and shared, and it is based on the ownership and control of the means of production, such as land, labor, and capital, if you remember. And for Marx, right, the Marxist view of power, right, power is derived from the economy. So those who control the economy will possess economic power, which is translated into other types of power, such as political power and religious power. On the other hand, right, Parsons' view of power is variable sum view, which we have looked at right before. It is based on the ability to mobilize and utilize resources, as we have seen, right? And if the polity is able to utilize societal and power resources adequately and efficiently, then we will have more resources, right, which allows us to pursue collective goals to benefit the welfare of the citizens. So we have already actually looked at the concept of power, but, right, for the postmodernists, such concepts, right, would no longer be useful. So we have to reconsider their usefulness and relevance to understanding postmodern society. Alright? Now, many postmodern ideas have been incorporated into modernist sociological theories. Now, for example, although right, Giddens is not a postmodernist, right, as well as Hall, right, such sociologists have used postmodernist ideas in understanding cultural identities, right, which is based on fluidity, right, and uncertainty. As we have seen that cultural identities are no longer stable, right, they are no longer permanent, they are highly fluid, they are highly uncertain and precarious, as we have seen earlier. Now, some sociologists, while rejecting the totality of postmodern theory, have developed a sociology of postmodernity. Now, they accept that many societies have been transformed into something different from modernity, and that is postmodernity. But they claim that this means transforming rather than abandoning existing sociological theories like Marxism or functionalism. So let's take a look at the Marxist and feminist theories of postmodernity. Now, the Marxist theories of postmodernity explore the links, the connection between economic factors and postmodernism. Now, for example, Jameson argued that postmodernism is the expression of a new form of late capitalism, where the production of culture has been integrated into commodity production. And here, images and style are no longer promotional accessories to economic products, but are the products themselves. So let me give you an example. Now, how many of you here actually own Apple iPhone or Apple iPad? Anyone? No, Apple is so unpopular. Right? So now, if you take a look at Apple gadgets, right, like the iPhone or the iPad, it's no longer just about the products, but it's about the image, the style associated with owning an Apple iPhone. Right? That means when you own an Apple iPhone, right, you're seen to be hip, to be trendy, right, to be part of the in crowd. So such image and style, right, are now part of commodity production. Right? They are no longer add-ons to the economic products. So that would be a very good example, right? Because the image, the style associated with Apple gadgets are now basically integrated into commodity production. They're part of the products themselves. They are not just promotional accessories. Right? So that's something that I would like to highlight to you. Right? So we have to take note of that. Now, next, modern feminist theories of gender tend to be based on the assumption that there are distinct differences between the experiences of men and women. Right? We learn that when we understand that gender is a social construct. Right? For example, we learn to be man, or woman as a result of gender socialization. Right? And in our society, men are expected to exhibit or display masculinity, masculine traits, to be independent, assertive, and even aggressive, right? While women are expected to display feminine traits and qualities, right? To be gentle, emotional, sensitive, docile, submissive, and subservient, right? So basically, right, there are very clear distinction between men and women in terms of their experiences. However, the postmodernist feminists reject, right, this dichotomous view between men and women as too straightforward or simplified, right? They claim that in contemporary societies, at least gender divisions and gender identities are no longer, right, so clear-cut, right? They argue that in the postmodern world, there are no such things as masculine and feminine identities. Instead, there are a multitude of masculinities and femininities, right, that individuals construct and create for themselves in different contexts, in different situations, and in different phases in their lives. Now, let me give you some examples, right? Now, for the guys here, right, how many of you here, right, would consider to be a house husband or full-time homemaker? Now, I would reckon that, right, there are not many guys actually, right? I would reckon that, right, usually, right, young men would not, right, fancy the idea of being a full-time homemaker or house husband. But when I posed the same question to my uni-sim students, my adult learners, many of them are much older, some of them are in their 40s and 50s, right? I was quite surprised that quite a handful of them actually expressed such interest that they would welcome the idea to be a homemaker or full-time house husband, right, if their wife, right, earns more, right? They have no issues with that, right? Because they are tired of the rat race in the corporate world, right? And if their wife earns much more than them, they don't mind putting on the apron to learn some new recipes, right? And to cook for the family, right? To do the dishes, to clean the home, right? And that is because, right, they are older, right, and they have enough, right, of work life, especially those in the 50s, right, the midlife, maybe the midlife stage, right? But for younger men, right, they would not welcome the idea to be a full-time homemaker and house husband. I'm sure for the guys here, right, after your degree, right, you want to basically, right, start work and get a stable job, right, get a good job, right, and you won't welcome the idea to be a homemaker or full-time house husband. But maybe 20 years later, that would be different. So, right, it depends on the context, the situation. So we create our own masculine or feminine identity. So there's a multitude of masculinities and femininities, right, that we constantly create depending on our life circumstances and situations and the different phases, right, of our lives. Now, for example, for a female individual, maybe when this female, right, individual, right, was younger, right, she could be more like tomboyish, right? Maybe she would like to mix with the guys, right? She may tend to be more rowdy, right, with the neighborhood guys. But when she is married, for example, right, when she's a wife and when she's a mother, right, she may start to be more feminine, right, because she's now married, right, and she has kids, right. So maybe she would basically be more gender, more motherly, right? And that would be her feminine identity at a later stage, right? So basically, it's up to the individual, right, in terms of how we create and construct our masculine and feminine identities. And this would imply that there's no such thing as pure, right, masculine or pure feminine identity, right? So, for example, to be a man, right, in the postmodern world, does not imply that you have to be aggressive, you have to be assertive, you have to be strong, right? You cannot be emotional, you cannot be sensitive. In the postmodern world, right, a man can be emotional, a man can be sensitive, a man can be vulnerable, and even basically even gentle, right? So that's the postmodern world. Likewise, for a woman, she is now, right, she's now no longer, right, sensitive, emotional, subservient, submissive to men, docile, vulnerable. She can be tough, she can be independent, she can be assertive and even aggressive, right? So it is up to the individual, right? So there's no longer this dichotomous a distinction between men and women in terms of masculinity and femininity, right? So if you take a look, right, it is not possible for men to keep long and shoulder length hair, right? Likewise, it is also possible, right, for women to have very short crew-cut hair, right, in the postmodern world. So there's no longer fixed, right, criteria in our understanding of gender identities, right? So that's something to take note of, right? It all depends on our life circumstances, right? It all depends on, right, the stage of in our life, right? The various phases, right, in our lives. So we create our own masculine and feminine identities according to our own preference, all right? Now, next, we need to consider the criticism of postmodern theory. Now, there is a contradiction, right, in the postmodern position. Now, the postmodernists are highly critical of the generalizations made in sociological theory. Now, yet, they make a major generalization themselves by claiming that the whole of Western society, the entire Western society, has been transformed from modernity to post-modernity. So in fact, right, the postmodern theory that we have discussed, right, in today's lecture could be described as another meta-narrative. So how ironical, right? Because remember earlier, right, the postmodernists accused, right, the sociologists of basically, right, creating meta-narratives, right, in our understanding of social change from pre-modernity to modernity. Yet, the postmodernists themselves, right, are also making such claim that the entire, right, contemporary society has been transformed from modernity to post-modernity. In fact, right, later, right, in the video, we will try to understand and illustrate this transition. So they themselves, right, the postmodernists themselves, are also, right, basically, right, using meta-narratives in terms of postmodern theory. Alright, so this is a major criticism, right? So it is indeed ironical. Now, next, the postmodernists are highly selective in their use of evidence, and they tend to ignore the many aspects of modernity that remain relatively unchanged. In fact, right, many aspects of the modern world will still be relevant. For example, our social status, our class, right, our social class, still have a very important influence on our life chances. For example, right, if you take a look at work, right, there are many occupations in today's world that are still gender specific. Right, for example, engineering and nursing. Right, and if you take a look at our local university, NUS, right, basically admission to very prestigious faculties like the medical faculty, right, would also be influenced somewhat by gender. Right? So if you look at two applicants with the same grades, right, if one is a male and the other is a female with the same grades, right, likely is that the male applicant will get admitted, right, over the female applicant. So gender would still be an important influence in terms of our life chances, especially at work and employment, right? And if you look at certain occupations, they're still gender specific, right? There's still biasness, right? Especially like pilots, right? Engineers, nurses, and so on, right? And even in today's contemporary society, right, most of the women, right, in the household are doing a large part of household chores and duties. A lot of my UniSim students, right, the adult learners who are married, right, would lament to me that they had a lot of pressures because they are expected, right, to compete with men on equal term at work because they have a full-time job, yet they are expected by their employer to upgrade. That explains why they are at UniSim, right? Instead of going home to, after work, right, they have to rush to UniSim, right, to attend lectures from 7 to 10 p.m. and after that complete assignments, and their assignments are quite tedious actually. They need to write like a 2,000 word essay and submit, right, online, right? They have quite a number of assignments to do, right, presentations as well. And yet, right, after 10, right, after class, they have to rush home and they are responsible for most of the household chores and duties, right? And they have to basically, right, serve their husbands, wait on on men, while their husbands are just like relaxing, watching TV, but they're expected to do most of the chores, you see. So they face a lot of pressure. So gender, right, is still actually a very important influence, right, on our life experiences, actually, right. So it is still relevant, right, compared to what the postmodernists would claim. And our social class as well. Why would I say that? Because of our social class, our social economic status will still affect, right, our life chances in education. For example, right, those children from influential, from middle or upper middle class backgrounds, right, they would enjoy social capital, right, that are advantages for success in education attainment. Because those children, right, from the upper class, right, or influential backgrounds, from the affluent backgrounds, they have higher social capital, they have connections, and they have resources that are advantageous in educational attainment. For example, children from well-to-do families, right, they have the best resources to help them to do well in terms of tutors, right? Some of the well-to-do families, right, I've heard they spend thousands of dollars, right, on tutors, enrichment classes to help their children to do very well, right, for major exams like PSLE exams and O-level examinations, right? And they have the connections to get into top schools, prestigious schools, and elite schools over the working class children, all right? And even at work, right, those from the affluent backgrounds, they have the connections, the networks that will help them to do well. They don't need the first class honors from UOL, right, because their parents are actually directors of some listed company, right? Can you imagine, right, if your parents are the CEOs of some companies, right, they have connections, right, to other CEOs of other listed companies, and through networks and connections, you can get a very high position, right, in a company. You don't even need the first class honors, right? So in this case, right, it shows that our social economic status will still be very relevant. It is not irrelevant, right, as claimed by the postmodernists. So I hope you get the idea. Now, the economic organizations that produce the goods and services are still characterized by rational planning and systematic organization. Remember, that is the concern of Weber, bureaucratization and rationalization of modern society. So many of the former large-scale organizations are still characterized by rational planning and systematic organization. A very good example that most of you can relate to would be SM. As an organization, as a formal organization, right? It is still characterized by rational planning, right? It is still characterized by systematic organization of the resources, especially human resources, right? And if you take a look at the state, right, we still see, right, effects and implications of living in a bureaucratic state, which increasingly regulates the lives of citizens, right, in such societies. So basically, right, we can still find that, right, there's still rationalization, right, and bureaucratization that is seen in formal organizations in contemporary societies. Another example would be fast food nation. Some sociologists claim that we are living in a fast food nation like McDonald's, right? And if you take a look at fast food chains like McDonald's, right, it is still characterized by rational planning in terms of the usage of resources, right? So take note of that. And like what I mentioned earlier, the nation states, right, especially the bureaucratic state in Weber's understanding, will still be important and influential in understanding, right, how the state, right, would control the lives of citizens in different aspects, right? If you take a look at Singapore, you can clearly see how the Singapore state, right, is highly influential in shaping, right, various aspects of our lives, right, from family arrangements, right, how the state will promote the formation of the nuclear family, right? You have a husband and wife and children. You don't have like 2 men or 2 women, right, in a family, or single parent family, or blended family, right? The state in Singapore, right, promotes the nuclear family as the ideal, right, family model that we should all have, right? You should all get married, right? You should basically have children, right? You should have a nuclear family. So the bureaucratic state, right, is still highly significant and influential, right, in shaping the lives of individuals, the citizens in society, all right? And even education, right? There's this compulsory education that the state has implemented, right? Every individual has to receive, right, at least, right, education to a certain level, right? So the bureaucratic state would also shape our experiences in terms of education. So the state is still relevant, right? Now, many of the things that the postmodernists see as characteristics of a new postmodern condition, such as greater choice, diversity, and the ability to create, right, to consume multiple pluralistic identities, tends to apply only, right, or at least mainly, to the affluent, the better off groups, right, which are the high income groups, right, the higher class in most developed societies. Now, what about the poorer groups, right, the less affluent ones, the working class, the lower class, those in the lower rungs of society, the socially disadvantaged, the marginalized groups, the oppressed groups? Do they have greater choice, right? Would they be able to create multiple identities? What about those living in developing societies, right? Developing regions like those in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa? Would they have greater choice? So it appears that people might have more choice in the contemporary societies, but it seems that some have more choice than others, right? So this would suggest that those who are from the middle class or upper class, right, the affluent groups in developed societies would have more choice compared to the poorer groups in developing societies, or basically, right, in poorer societies. Now, the postmodern critique of the possibility of discovering true and universal knowledge of societies is not new. Now, the anti-empiricist view is shared by the realists. Remember, we mentioned that in realism, one of the three types of theory under epistemology, it is non or anti-empiricist, right? Meaning that we have to try to uncover the underlying hidden mechanisms that result in observable regularities, the hidden reality that we are keen to find out, right? The underlying mechanisms that bring about observable events and regularities. It is non-empiricist or anti-empiricist. That is a contrast to positivism, as we have seen in chapter 3. Now, also, Weber was highly critical of the nomothetic approaches used in sociology. Now, the nomothetic approaches are used by Marx and Durkheim, where they basically write theories which are very general, very universal, highly abstract. Right? But Weber's theory is ideographic theory or ideographic approach, and Weber was influenced by Immanuel Kant. It's in your lecture notes, right? And his approach will be ideographic approach or ideographic theory, which is time and place specific. But for Marx and Durkheim, it will be nomothetic approaches or nomothetic theory, right? Which considers theory as highly general, universal, and abstract. Now, the phenomenologists, can anyone of you here name me, right, the leading theories for phenomenology? Who founded this micro-perspective? Anyone? Edmund Husserl. All right? And other phenomenologists, right, would include Luckmann, right, Berger, Atkinson, and Douglas, all in your notes. All right? Now, the phenomenologists can explain the changes in the way people identify themselves. Remember, the phenomenologists, right, are very keen to find out how individuals make sense of the situations in which they find themselves in, right? And the phenomenologist, right, claims that our social reality, right, is socially constructed. Remember the social construction of reality by Berger and Luckmann, right? Now, however, this does not imply that sociology has to descend into relativism, where any theory or research, right, is just as good as any other. For example, the realists also recognize the impossibility of obtaining absolute knowledge of the social world. Remember, the realists, right, they claim that theories can only provide us with partial and selective
and selective truths about the social world, we will not have full and complete understanding of society. But they argue that theories can still be found to be more or less valid. Remember, the realists, they argue that all data is theory dependent. All data is shaped by theory because the researcher's own values and interests will shape what they attempt to discover. Alright? And that is why they use mixed methods, right, which are theory specific. Alright? And they use a mixture of quantitative and or qualitative methods. And that is why, basically theories can still found to be more or less valid. Now next will be the application of postmodern theory to education. Now there's no specific pattern of education. People do not feel the need, to follow formal educational norm in the postmodern world. The formal educational norm is that to receive education, you have to be institutionalized in formal school settings. You have to take major examinations, like in Singapore society, the PSLE, the primary school living examination, the O-levels, the A-levels, and so on. But individuals, postmodern society, can choose what type and what level of education they want to pursue. So individuals may feel that they do not need higher or tertiary education for success. Some may even believe that one can succeed without formal education, like a lot of success stories of some business tycoons. They do not have formal education. If you take a look at Singapore, some of you here are familiar with Mustafa, he's so successful, in the retail industry, and he did not have, higher education, And a lot of property and business tycoons, in Singapore and Hong Kong, they do not have, higher education, And these ideas are influenced by the media. And a very good example, of success stories where individuals can attain success, without formal education. One that I will provide you an example because many of you may know. How many of you here are fans of Boon Tong Kee? The chicken rice chain. Now, the owner used to be a cleaner for many years, But you see, he did not have higher education, but he's able to successfully run and expand the chicken rice chain that is so successful, The brand itself. Once you think of Boon Tong Kee, you think of chicken rice, delicious chicken rice. And he used to be the owner, but used to be a cleaner for many, many years, from what I know, He certainly does not have any degree, And a lot of success stories, And even some roti prata seller at Jalan Kayu, I heard, they don't have formal education as well, but they're so successful, And I even found out, that one of the owner of the roti prata even stayed in a mansion, very huge mansion, at Jalan Kayu, that I basically went to take a look at the mansion. It was so huge, There's elephant statues. It's really a huge mansion that 20 old people can live. So I'm so curious. I just take a look at what the house that he's staying from outside, It's really very huge, and I was quite surprised that just a roti prata seller can be so rich, because a lot of so-called white-collar professionals like senior managers, bankers, academics, they are not as successful as these so-called hawkers, So we get the idea that it is possible for us to attain success even without higher formal education. And also in the postmodern world, it is not essential, it's not necessary. It's not necessary to follow formal educational norm. There are quite a number of cases in Singapore where parents homeschooled their children, homeschooling, They don't want their children, to be in formal institutions. They don't want them to be institutionalized in schools, So they actually teach their own children at home, or they hire personal tutors. So their students are actually homeschooled, They don't attend schools. And even in UL, actually, you can learn the courses independently. You don't need to attend lectures. It's up to you. You don't need to pay SIM. Actually, what you pay, is not to the lecturers. It's mainly to SIM, Because when you pay to them, most of it, right, goes to the revenues actually, the sales generator, right? But you as an individual, some students, right, may decide that they want to study independently, all the courses, right, just study on your own, read the text, read the guide, right, go through the work yourself. You don't need any help, right? You don't need to be in class. You can do your own independent study, right? So it's up to you as an individual in the postmodern world, right? So in terms of education, we don't follow any conventions. That is the main point, right? In terms of following, right, the norms. There are no longer norms, right, in terms of education, because, right, if you take a look at in the past, when you tell people that, right, you are an undergrad, right, or you are basically a student, the impression is that you attend schools to receive education, right? But now if you tell people that you are learning, right, you are a student, you need not attend classes like online learning. You can get an online degree. You don't even need to attend lectures, right? All lectures are conducted online. All assignments, forms of assessments like quizzes, like tests, right, are all administered online. You don't even have to leave your home, right? You self-study and you take all the online assessments. Because in UniSim, right, we have actually blended courses and online courses where students don't actually have to attend lectures. All forms of assessment are online, right? And they can view my lectures, right, on the internet. They don't need to attend my lectures, actually, right? So there's no conventional norms where we have to adhere to rigidly in the postmodern world. So everything depends on you as an individual, but we have now greater choice. But the choice, right, that we have will be influenced by the media, right? What we have read, what we have seen, right? So that's something that I would like to highlight to you. So let's do a recap, right? Now, postmodern theory argues that many modern societies are becoming transformed into a new kind of society known as postmodern societies, right? And we know that, right? We've noted that postmodern societies are highly uncertain, they are fragile, they are diversified, they are fragmented, right? And this requires a new form, a new type of sociological thinking, right? Theory known as postmodern theory that will reflect the fragmentation and the diversity of the contemporary world. However, many contemporary sociologists will reject this idea. Nevertheless, right, postmodern theory has opened up new questions on issues such as culture, identity, and media, and has had a significant effect on contemporary sociological theory. In fact, right after the break, right, when we discussed about the postmodern social theory through the video, right, there are case studies, right, on the media on gender, which will be very useful illustrations, right? Now, these are the questions that are basically very useful for your revision for the whole chapter 4. Now, you're expected to do your readings first before you attempt them. Now, not to worry, I've already provided you with the answers for these questions on Sim Connect, which you can download, right? But please do not regurgitate or memorize the answers. They're just a guide as a reference to help you with your revision, because some of you may not know, right, the expectations, so you can refer, right? All the basically answers have been provided, so you can refer, right? And today, right, we will finish up in chapter 4, right? The next lecture, which is next year, right? We will start on section B of globalization, right? And we will have the second class test too. Now, not to worry, it's open book, so you can still enjoy your Christmas, your New Year, but you can refer to your lecture notes when you do the test, right? But of course, if you don't do the test, right, it's up to you. Because remember, we mentioned that knowledge is just a commodity, right? If you feel that sociology is important, of course you will take the test, but if you feel that it's rubbish, it's nonsense, you can choose not to do it. I won't force you, right? That is the postmodern way of thinking, alright? So we will now take a break, and after which, right, we will do a recap of what we have discussed thus far, right, and focus on what we have discussed today in our lecture, which is the understanding of from modernity to post-modernity, right? Now, any of you here have not collected your